We've been asking the question for a couple weeks now, why is it so hard to live for God? To truly, fully, consistently live for God. Why is it so difficult? We're here, we want to, but I think we'd all admit it's difficult. And we've said that the alternative, if I'm not living for God in any specific situation, I'm living for me. And on the surface, that might be understandable. I think we'd all admit we can be selfish at times. But stop and think. Selfish means I'm trying to do what's best for me. Well, wouldn't it be best for me to live for God? The creator of the universe. He's shown, his power, control, and everything. And then he sent his son. He's shown his love. And wouldn't it be best to live for him? How is it? In any situation, in any circumstance, I would choose to live for me and not him. And we've said, I think the reason is our image of God has gotten distorted by sin. Sin affects us, not just in that we do bad things, but we don't see things right. We don't see them correctly. We don't see God. And so in this series, we've been looking at two traits of God so far. His control, which again is a combination of his awareness. God always knows what is happening to us. There's never a moment that he's unaware of what you're going through and what's inside you. And then second, his wisdom. God knows where you are, what's going on. He also knows what would be best for you and how to get you there. And then his power is able to work in ways that will make that possible. Doesn't force it to happen, cause it to happen necessarily, but he puts us in situations where we can act in a way to bring that about. What God sees is the best for us. God's control, and then obviously God's love. Those are the two key traits, the lenses I'm calling for looking at all of life. And if we do that, it will change the way we look at life. It'll change the way we live life. Well, to do this, we've looked at Ephesians chapters 1 through 3, really 1 and 3. Paul has a prayer there. He prays. He says, God, I pray that these people would know, the Ephesians then and us today, I pray they would know your power, control. And I pray they would know your love. And then look how he ends this prayer in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 19. I pray all that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And we saw that last week, this idea of the fullness of God, everything about God, all his moral goodness, everything, his view of the world, which his is perfect. I pray that would be us. And he says, I pray that you may be filled with that. And we said to be filled up with something means there's nothing else. Not nothing else in our life, but as we talk about this, nothing else that we rely on or trust in. And I'm going to be using those terms. They're the same thing. When we talk about trust, it's not just I believe something. I rely on it. And nothing else. Filled up with God. I rely on him and him alone for whatever it is, for satisfaction, for significance, for security, whatever my need in life, I rely on God and God only. That's what Paul prays for us. And as I was preparing this sermon, I stopped to think, and I think that's what we all truly want. Down deep, we want God to be enough. We want God to be all that we need and all that we rely on, all that we trust in. We want it to be true. We hear these stories of people, and it sounds like it's true for them. And we think, I want that, God. I want that to be true. But I think that what happens is oftentimes we want to see it first. Before I can totally, make that leap of faith, and not a blind leap of faith, but there is an element, a leap of faith. Take that step of faith. Before I do it, God, I want to see it first, that you're enough. And that's not how it works. It's not faith if we see it first. Faith and sight are the opposites. And here's the thing. Paul, as he's been praying that in Ephesians, as we've been looking at it, Paul doesn't want us to know. And remember that word know? It's not just know in my mind, but it's to experience fully. It's that Greek word gnosko. Tell me you didn't say that a few times this week. Gnosko, yeah. It's that word. Paul says, I want you to know this. He doesn't pray that we would know these things so that we would be able to trust God. No. Here's the thing. Knowing God in that way, in that personal, experiential way, and being filled up with all the fullness of God, we have to trust God first. We have to trust him to see those things come about in our life. And that's what we're going to look at today, is this idea of trusting. And here's the thing. We've been asking this question, why is it so hard to live for God? Well, if we're filled up with all the fullness of God, if we know God in these ways, which comes from trusting Him, we will live for God. We'll make the right choices. And so it starts again with this. This is foundational. And so as we look at the subject of trust, we're going to look at Abraham. He probably comes to mind. He's often called the father of the faith. Abraham, Genesis chapter 22. We're going to be there. If you have your Bibles, open them up, first book of the Bible. So you just flip through a little bit, page 14, if you want to use the blue Bibles underneath the chairs in front of you. And while you're doing that, just to refresh our memory about Abraham, God had called him. You remember, God's like, I want to start a nation with you. And it was all to bring about the Messiah. It goes back, and we've looked at this. God said when sin first entered the world, I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to send someone. Well, he looked at Abraham and said, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. You'll have descendants so many you can't even count. You will be blessed, and the world will be blessed through you. And that's what it was for. Well, God called Abraham when Abraham was 75. His wife was 65. He makes this promise to Abraham, God does, you'll have numerous descendants. Well, at this point, he didn't even have one. Not even one child. And that was old, even for as long as they lived. They should have had a child by then. Time goes on, and still 20, 21, 22, 23 years later, 24, they still haven't had this child. It's not till Abraham is 100 and Sarah is 90 that they finally have this son, Isaac, that God is going to work through to create this nation. And then once and we don't know exactly how old he is. I was looking at this and there's just no indication. It does seem from some of the things he does, Isaac was probably, at least 15, maybe 20, maybe a little more. So the son that he'd waited for so long, and now he's seeing him grow, and he just begin to think it's finally coming about. And then in Genesis chapter 22, you know what happens. God says, Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son. You put him to death on an altar. And now, if you've heard this story before, you know it very quickly. It says it in the text, and preachers are very quick to say it was a test. God did not really want him to put his son to death. That was not the ultimate goal. He was testing Abraham. Well, raises the question, what was God testing in him? What was God testing? Was he testing his obedience? Will you obey me, Abraham? I tell you this. His level of commitment. I've seen how far you're willing to go. Will you go this far? His priorities, his willingness to sacrifice. I don't think it was any of those. That's not what was being tested here. And what is being tested here is essential for what Paul wants us to know and experience, this to be filled up with this fullness of God. Now, here's the thing. As we go through this, you're not going to see anywhere where it says, Abraham trusted in God's control and love, and that's why he did what he did. I wish we did. It'd be a great verse. I'd quote that one, be the theme verse for the whole series. But Abraham did trust in those, we're going to see, because he had seen God's control. He had seen his love throughout his life, and he trusted in those. And here's the thing. As we look at this, you won't always see those exact words, but reflect on what you see. See what it is these people trusted in, how they did what they did. So let's look at this. Chapter 22 of Genesis, verse 1. It says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now, when you see a phrase like that, sometime later, it's not just some passing reference, like, hey, after this happened. It's meant to connect it back to something else. It's like the word therefore. Whenever you see the word therefore in the Bible, stop and see what it's there for. What is it referencing? Well, what is this referencing? Because this whole thing that happens here, it's in the context of what happened sometime before. And you just need to go back to the previous chapter, chapter 21, and we're going to look at this event that is the context for this. Chapter 21, verse 22. It says, at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of the forces, and that would be of the Philistine forces, so this is the king and the general of the Philistines, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. They've been observing him, and they know God is working. He says, now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me in the country where you are living as an alien the same kindness I have shown you. Abraham said, I swear it. So this king sees that God has been working, and Abraham's been there for a while in the land of the Philistines. According to the king, he feels they've treated Abraham kindly. He says, when things change and maybe you become more powerful, treat us the same way. And Abraham says, I swear. Well, then look, now that they have this great new relationship, they're buds now, Abraham says, hey, I've got a little thing. Verse 25. He complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. So Abraham had dug this well, no small task, and Abimelech's servants had, kicked him out, and they'd taken it over. So he complains about that. Like, that shouldn't be. Well, verse 26, Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You didn't tell me. I only heard about it today. So he's not really jumping up to the plate. Verse 27, so Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty. So they took things a step further. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs you have set apart by themselves? He replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So the place was called Beersheba because the 2 men swore an oath there. And so it doesn't say it, but Abimelech used his influence to get this well back for Abraham. And then verse 32, after the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. Now, whenever you see that phrase, called upon the name of the Lord in the book of Genesis, it's talking about public worship. Not just a personal prayer, but whatever the expression would be, some sacrifice, calling out to God in prayer, that was public worship. So it's saying Abraham worshiped God. And that's awesome, isn't it? To worship God. But look what he had just done. Just before worshiping God, and in worshiping God, you're saying, God, you are awesome, you're great, and I'm trusting in you. It sort of hedged his bets a little, hadn't he? That's what really happened there with Abimelech. I realize Abimelech initiated it, but then Abraham, once things are set there, he's like, hey, I got this problem. Can you take care of it? And, this treaty that, and Abraham in his mind, I'm trusting in God, but I've got Abimelech here too if something comes up. And here's the thing. If this was all we had, you may not get it from that, but Abraham has shown this characteristic his whole life. From the time we've seen him. We talk about Abraham, taking this tremendous step of faith when God called him from his hometown of Ur, which, from what we can tell, as modern as things were back then, it had indoor plumbing, so that was a big plus. And God says, I want you to go and be a nomad. Just go out, I'm not even going to tell you where at first. And Abraham does it. Now, what a step of faith. He trusted in God. But then throughout the rest of his life and these years that we look at, we see he trusted in God and various other things. When he got to the land of Canaan and there was a famine, Abraham trusted in God and in Egypt because they didn't have a famine there. So he went down to Egypt. God didn't tell him to do that. Later on, as God has made this promise, I'm going to make a great nation of you. He still has no son as the years go by. Abraham trusted in God and this idea he came up with of adopting his servant. And he puts it out to God, and God says, no, that's not how it's going to happen. You are going to have a son with Sarah. Well, goes on and still doesn't have a son, and he trusts in God. And this idea that Sarah has later of, hey, have a son with my maidservant, Hagar, that he got from Egypt where he shouldn't have been going. And he doesn't ask God, and he does have that son. So again, you see this habit in his life. He trusts in God, and he trusts in other things. He sort of hedges his bet. Like, God, I'm just not sure if you're enough. I'm not sure if you'll get me through, you'll get me by. So there's these other things. And so that's what the focus is here. When it says sometime later, it's sometime after this. God tests him. And when that word test, when it says God tested Abraham, here's the thing. That testing can sometimes be to reveal what's present. You take a math test. You in class, you studied some subject in math for a week, 2 weeks. The teacher gives you a test to reveal. What did you learn? What's in your head? What's there? But testing can also be to refine. Here on Memorial Day, a battle-tested veteran. It doesn't mean the battle revealed what was there. It means it helped produce what was there. James uses the word that way. James 1:3, the testing of your faith produces perseverance. It doesn't just reveal what's there, it produces it. Well, that's this kind of test. It refined something. Again, what? Well, let's keep looking here. Sometime later, verse 1, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. And we look at that, and immediately what we realize is here's a father being asked to sacrifice his son. And it says, the son whom you love. And that is definitely part of this dynamic. Just, again, to stop and think about that. But there's another element here, too. It's not just the fact that this is a son and every father loves his son. Notice where it says your only son? Again, and it's talking about this covenant that God has made. We read about this in Hebrews 11. It says there, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice, so he was willing to. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. So saying he had embraced these promises for 25 years till he's born, and then again another 15 or 20. Abraham he's banking on this. His whole life has been invested in this promise God made, and here he's about to put to death the way the promise is going to be fulfilled. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Keep that in mind. It's not just Abraham loves his son, that's true. But this is how this whole thing is going to come about, and now it's in jeopardy. What God is asking him to do. Verse 3, after God asked him this, it says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Now, just stop there for a second. We're going to see in the next verse, it's a 3-day journey. And I looked at that, and it says, early the next morning. Like, why did you really have to get up early? I mean, you got 3 days ahead or some time. Boy, of all the times to maybe just delay things a little, this would be one. And then it says he cut enough wood. Apparently he either knew there wouldn't be wood somewhere or wasn't sure, so he had to take it with him. And I had the thought, my mind works, it's like, wouldn't it be tempting to not cut enough wood? Cut just a little wood, and then you get there and say, oh, Scott, I don't have enough wood. I'm going to have to go back, and maybe things will change somewhere between the back and forth. But he's fully committed. Verse 4, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. A couple things there. I see this trip. Again, it took 3 days. And then twice it says they went on from there. It wasn't over yet. They went on. They went on. And it made me think, it's one thing when God, leads you in some way and you realize, I need to do this. And we say, all right, I'm going to do it. But then sometimes when you have time to stop and think about it, all the reasons not to do it, all the consequences, all the difficulties, they come to mind. And that commitment you had right at first, it's hard to maintain that sometimes. And especially, it says they went on together. And when God first called Abraham, it was just Abraham. God said, sacrifice your son. That's difficult enough, but his son wasn't right there. His son wasn't asking him, where's the lamb for the sacrifice, Father? Talk about really bringing it home. But Abraham keeps going. He continues to obey, and it raises the question for me at least, how did he do that? How did he do it? And so often we focus on Jesus, and we've all seen the bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And we need to know what Jesus would do. You know what's even more important than what would Jesus do is, how did Jesus do it? HD, what's that? HDJD, it. That should be the bracelet. We know what he did, and we often know what we should do, but how did he do it? How did Abraham do this? Well, verse 5 gives a clue. It says there, Abraham says to these 2 servants, we, Isaac and I, will worship, and then we will come back to you. Well, how are you coming back? You're going to kill Isaac. How are we, the 2 of you, coming back? Well, what do you have in mind there? Well, Hebrews tells us, Hebrews 11:19. It says, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. Apparently, Abraham thought, I am going to have to kill my son, but God is going to bring him back from the dead. Now, why would he think that? Why would he reason that? Had he ever seen God raise anyone from the dead? No. But Romans tells us something that puts this in perspective. Romans 4 says, without weakening in his faith, is talking about Abraham, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. So this is before Isaac is born. He's almost 100 years old, and he still has faith. God can pull this off, even though my body's as good as dead. I haven't had He had the one son, but things haven't worked with Sarah. Her womb is also dead. He looks at it like there's just no way, physically, by sight, but he trusts. And so he apparently put that together and thought, well, God brought life out of these dead bodies. He can bring a dead body back to life. And that's where this is coming from here. He had seen God's power. He had seen God's control throughout his life, and it all demonstrated God's love. And Abraham said, I don't see what's going to happen now, but I'm trusting what I've seen in the past. And he obeyed. And here's the thing we need to realize. The basis of all obedience. Sometimes it's more clear than others. The basis of all obedience is faith. Whenever we're faced with a situation, do I obey God or not? Do I do this thing he said to do? Do I not do this thing he said not to do? It comes down to faith that God's way is best. And the corollary of that, and we talk about the basis for obedience, well, what is the foundational temptation of all sin? Specific sins have specific temptations. This will bring me pleasure, this will bring me prestige, this will bring me whatever, all these things, specific ones. But at the heart of every temptation, what's there? It's this idea that I'll be better off if I don't obey God. God says to do this, and I can see if I obey God, here's what's going to happen. If I don't obey God, here's what's going to happen. Looks like I'll be better off. God says don't look at this certain thing. I can see if I look at it, I'll be better off. Don't do this certain thing. If I do it, I'll be better off. Or maybe, God said don't lie, and I'm in this situation. Well, if I lie, I escape these repercussions, these consequences. If I tell the truth, wow, looks like I'll be better off. Every choice we make, to obey God or not, to sin or not, comes down to faith. No, you won't be better off. Ultimately, you'll be better off if you trust God and obey him. And that's what Abraham was basing his obedience on. So look what he does. Verse 9, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. You can just imagine what's going on in his mind. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by his horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Now here's the thing, that phrase, to this day, you need to realize Abraham lived around the year 2000 before Christ, 2000 BC. Moses lived about 1450 or so, 1450, 1500. So you got over 500 years. And Moses is saying, to this day, people still mark what happened there. You think that's a tremendous witness and testimony? And we need to make sure we've got testimonies like that in our lives. If nothing else, as parents, we need to make sure our children are aware of how God provides, what he does in our lives, and pass it on, talk to them about it, so they can say at this point in mom and dad's life, God provided, and it will help them to have faith. You need to pass it on to others. We need, again, this whole idea of community. Talk to each other. Here's what God did. Make sure there's a witness there. So again, this all started. God tested Abraham. Once again, what was God testing? What was being refined? What was being produced? Well, sometimes you have to step back and ask the question, all right, what was the problem? What was the problem that God was dealing with, that he was testing and trying to refine? And it goes back to that idea of Abraham trusted in God and these other things. His whole life he'd struggled with that, trusting in God and here he is, he does it again. I trust in you, God, and what Abimelech can do for me because he's the king. And I look at our lives and I think, how often do we trust in God and we're here today, to some degree we trust in God. We can't always see what God's going to get us, and so it's so tempting to trust in God and, again, maybe when it comes to our satisfaction, this idea of just being okay with life. God, I got everything I need. I trust in you. And there is that one possession that if I didn't have that, I just don't know if I could be satisfied, God. Maybe a bunch of possessions. God, I trust in you for my satisfaction and this one thing that I do that is just so important to me. Now, here's the thing. It's not wrong to have possessions, to have hobbies, to do things, but it's when we elevate them there and put them on that same level that without them, God, I just couldn't be satisfied. Maybe it's some idea, expectation we have for our health. God, I'm satisfied with you and with at least this basic level of health. This basic level of wealth, of getting by. Things not being too difficult. I'm satisfied. Maybe when it comes to our significance, that source of, God, I feel good about myself. My significance, my self-worth. God, that comes from you, being a child of you. And it comes from this job that I have that just, I get things done. I see results. People appreciate it. Trust in you, God, and maybe some achievement. I look at that and say, wow, here's what I've accomplished. Wow. And that's my significance, God and that thing. Maybe it's God and respect. I've earned the respect of people, and that's what gives me that source of significance. And I thought about it this morning. Sometimes it's the other side of things, God and respect. Well, what about God and a lack of criticism? God, as long as I'm not criticized by people, I trust in you, and as long as no one's criticizing me, that's my source of significance. And then the one I think is tempting for all of us all the time, security. How do I know everything's going to be okay? Well, of course, we trust in God, right? God and that paycheck that comes in. Again, it's not wrong to have a paycheck coming in. It's wrong to put that on that same level. Trust in you, God, and my bank account. As long as it's at a certain level, then I feel good. Everything's under control. My retirement account. Or maybe it's not money. One thing I've realized, sometimes it's, it's some sense of knowing what's going to happen. God, I trust in you for security and seeing, a pretty good idea. Here's where things are headed in life. That's what gives me a sense of security. Here's the problem. That's not faith. And maybe we think as Christians, especially as we start our Christian life, maybe we're there, like, God, I know I trust in you and these things, but I'm working at it. I'm just going to progress and mature. And as I see you work, as I see you come through in these ways, then I'll back off them a little bit and back on you a little more and just go a little bit off of that, a little bit onto you, God, and never really taking any step there. Certainly not a leap. It doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. Here's the thing. You'll never see God work until you trust he works. Because that's how he works. It's through our faith, through our trust. Again, Paul doesn't want us to know God, to know his control and love so that we can trust him. He doesn't want okay, I'll show this to you at first. You'll see it clearly exactly what's going to happen. Now you can trust him. That's not trust. To know God in that way, to experience the fullness of God, to be filled with all the fullness, we've got to trust first. Abraham didn't just trust in God and, there was something else that was there. He thought it was okay to trust in God and. You see what he did? He makes this deal, this treaty with Abimelech, which Abimelech came to him, okay, but then you see Abraham start to rely on it, and you see his past. He makes this treaty with him, and then he worships God, and you get this impression. He's like, well, that's just how it works, a little bit of the world, a little bit of God. I can see a little bit of this, I trust a little bit of God. It all goes together. He thought it was okay. And we think it's okay. Of course I trust in God, but got this little backup there. Got this in the back pocket just in case. It's not okay. Here's the problem. Faith in God and isn't faith in God. It's faith in the and. If you have faith in God and something else, for whatever area of life, you don't really have faith in God. You have faith in the and, whatever it is. How do I know that? Because when the and changes, we change. My peace, lack of worry about life goes up and down regarding how the and does. My joy in life goes up and down regarding how the and does. My anger, all these things, they're tied to the and. Because here's the deal. God doesn't change. God never changes. So if we are changing, if our peace, our joy, anything else, our faith's not in God, it's in the and. And I've realized that myself recently. I shared a couple weeks ago that, some things were happening, and I described myself as a little out of it. Lisa said, you're grumpy. Let's just be honest. That's what it is. And I realized it's because I was not trusting in God's control. And as I did this sermon, it became even more clear. I was trusting in God and a couple other things. Again, Lisa and I both, like, God, just what do you want for us? Guide us, Lord, please. And it seemed like he had shown some answers, and so I was feeling pretty good. I had a sense of peace. All right, God, I know where things are headed. And then this other variable entered, like, oh, man, the and changed. God didn't change. The and did, and so did my peace. It went way down. My joy went way down. My anger went up. And then there's always that idea of money. Again, I left this one job and had an idea in mind. It just has not moved, but God has provided in amazing ways. Amazing ways. And one way he provided, was a tax return. And so I looked at the bank, and for a long time, it's like, wow, this should be going down. It's not going down. And felt pretty good. I was trusting in God. And then I realized it was God and, because that amount that I've been seeing for so long, it was down, all of a sudden I open up and it's like down to half. You would think at least I'd have half the piece, right? Just mathematically. Okay, I had this much piece, half I should have. I didn't have half. It probably wasn't even 10%. And I realized, all right, I'm trusting in God and a certain level in my bank account. And here's the thing, too, to keep in mind, lest you think, oh, I've learned that lesson, move on. I said that this sermon series here, it's the same subject that I preached on my very first sermon back about 4 years ago. And in that sermon, I gave an illustration very similar to this. I stepped down from here, and we didn't know exactly how God was going to provide, but we did trust. I didn't realize I was trusting then in God and we had this Wells Fargo credit limit. Didn't want to use it, but it was a $7,000 credit limit at Wells Fargo, so I felt pretty good. God, I trust in you. If things don't work out, I got that in my back pocket. Well, I get this letter from Wells Fargo saying and they didn't use the word slash, but they slashed our credit limit from $7,000 to $300. I freaked out. Whoa. And that's what told me right away. I wasn't trusting in God because guess what? He didn't change. And I thought I'd learned that lesson. I preached a sermon almost 4 years ago, and I thought I learned that lesson, and here I am. Comes up again. It's going to come up again. So be ready for it. We will never fully experience the fullness of God until we trust in God alone. We've got to get there. And that's what God was doing with Abraham. That's what he was testing. That's what he was refining. And then when he sees it, look at verse 12. He says, now I know that you fear God. And we're always a little afraid of that word, fear God. Like, oh, well, I don't want to be afraid of God. And so we sometimes say, well, it's respect him, it's revere him. No, it's fear in the sense of he's God. He can squish us like a bug. Now, is he going to do that? No, because he loves us, but he can. And so there is an element of fearing God, and especially in this context, it says, now I know that you fear God. What's he saying? Prior to this, you fear God, and you feared Abimelech. If he wasn't on your side, if he wasn't there in your corner, things might not work out. Now I know that you fear God, and just God. And because of that, verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord. I love that. Who else is God going to swear by? I swear by myself. And you need to realize, too, when you see that phrase, angel of the Lord, in the Old Testament, from what we can tell, that was the person before he became Jesus, the person of the Son, the second person of the Trinity, coming to earth in a form and interacting with people. So that's why it's God, the angel of the Lord, called to Abraham, said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the skies and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Now, you remember I said God had already called Abraham like 35, 40 years before and promised him that exact same thing? And in another time in life, God had repeated this promise, and you're tempted to think, well, okay, God, are you like continually adding these conditions? Like, now I'm going to do it, that you did this. I said I was going to do it before, but now I'm really going to do it. It reminded me, our youngest daughter is wanting a phone. And she's got this one that's sort of, pay by the minute, whatever. She wants a real phone, And we told her, all right, as we start to think about that, you need to be responsible and do some chores. And so she has done a pretty good job of doing her chores. Well, about a week ago, both her older sister and my wife, Lisa, tried to call them, and neither one of them had their phones on or with them. I'm like, oh, that's not good. That's why we buy you a phone. And so we told our youngest daughter that, like, listen, if you're not going to keep your phone with you, you're not going to get one. She's like, what, you're adding conditions? Like, no, that one's foundational. We don't buy you a phone so you can call your friends at your convenience. It's so we can call you whenever we want. Well, that's what it is with Abraham. God's not like adding some condition. The condition all along was faith. And it needed to get to the point of faith in God alone. And it finally got there with what happened through this testing. See, the things that God wants to see happen, and I mean the big things, the really big things that take God and his power, those things that he wants to see in and through us, they can't happen with God and. It just won't. Because again, it's not faith in God. But the fullness of God that Paul talks about, that God wants us to have, that will happen. We will experience that, us personally and as a church, when we trust in God alone. And that's why it's so important. And so how do we get there? How do we get to God alone? Because I think every one of us can stop and think, well, there has been an and, or maybe some ands. How do I get to God alone? And the answer is allow God to strip away whatever that and is. Allow him to reveal it and allow him to strip it away. And God will do that. God will provide for us, just like he did Abraham, tests, these situations that if we choose to act in faith, will refine us, will produce this faith that is God and God alone. But here's the thing, and we need to be ready for it. We need to realize, we need to gnosko, that there's going to come a point in those situations, and it's going to come to the spot where I need to trust God is either in control and he loves me, or he isn't, and he doesn't. That's what it comes down to, and I've seen that myself. I'm facing these difficulties, and I'm going a little back and forth, and I realize it comes down to that. Act like it's true or act like it's not. Quit wavering in the middle. And that's what we need to do. And we need to be ready for. We need to truly look through these lenses of control and love and live our life that way. Well, what do I need to do? Again, specifically, personally, what do I need to do? And the first step is truly examine. Am I trusting in God and something else? And to find out, ask yourself, my peace, my sense of, not being worried or anxious, my joy, maybe the negative, my anger, does it fluctuate based on something? When this changes, I have less peace, I have more anger. Well, then that something is the and that you're trusting in. That's how you know. And so then once you identify it, you need to ask, what do I need to do to change? What do I need to do to make this different? And again, be ready for a test, because God will give you one. He's good at that. But face it with that total commitment that says, God, I can't see exactly what you're going to do here, but I've seen everything you've done in the past. I've seen your control. I've seen your love, and I'm going to trust it now. And God will work. And God will remove that and he'll refine your faith. And what's it going to look like when that happens? Well, look at the last verse here, verse 19. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Now remember at the end of chapter 21, it said he was staying in Beersheba. He was planning on that all along. Don't you think his stay's different now than it would have been if this had never happened? And you think his whole perspective on life, his relationship with God, his experience of God, gnoskoing God, you think it was different now than it would have been? Absolutely. The same thing's true for us. You know what? You and I are staying here. For as long as God says you're staying here, whether it's this physical place, whether it's this life, we're staying. Wouldn't you rather stay knowing God, gnoskoing God in that full personal way and being filled up with all the fullness of God? Isn't that what you want your stay to be like? I do. And to do that, again, we've got to take the step of faith first. We can't wait and see. God, show me it's going to work out. Show me exactly how it's going to work out. Then I'll trust you. That's not trust. That's sight. We've got to be willing to do it. And when we are, here's the thing. The end result of all this, by the way, it's we will obey God. Going back to, why is it so hard to live for God? We will live for God. We'll obey him. Now, I planned on spending a lot more time today focused on that obedience, and I got to this passage, and it's still about, here's what needs to happen first. Get this in place, and the other will happen. It'll take care of itself. If you're here today and you have never made a commitment to God, that's the first step. That's where it starts, the real foundation. And if you have some questions about what do I need to do? Do I have that relationship? I know I don't. I need to do this. The Bible says you need to believe, you need to repent, you need to be baptized. If you have questions about that, come forward as the praise team sings this song. Or maybe you're here today and like Abraham, you've lived a life, a long time with God, but it's been God and you're like, I want to get to God alone. If you got some questions, you want someone to pray with you, come forward as they sing this song.